not long ago, we had 4 Christian missionaries who were arrested for passing out the Gospel of St. John on a public street. The police arrested them for disturbing the peace. The only way they were disturbed, they were obviously conducting themselves, this was on videotape, they were doing constitutionally protected activity that you would expect to be sort of the norm in New York, in the United States. But you know, in Islam, under Sharia, there's a proscription against the proselytism of faiths other than Islam. And whether the police understood they were doing this or not, whether they were just trying to prevent a potentially combustible situation or not, the fact is that they were enforcing a Sharia prescription against the preaching of a faith other than Islam. It's very troubling, and it's particularly troubling because 15 years ago, when we prosecuted the blind sheikh, he wanted his defense at trial to be that he was simply conducting himself in accordance with the traditional rule of the Muslim cleric, to whom the faithful come and propose some course of conduct or another, and the blind sheikh has to say either it's permitted or it's not permitted under Islamic law. And he wanted to argue to the jury that just because he had green-lighted terrorist plots, that didn't mean that he should be culpable because he was merely doing what his religion required him to do. Now, I remember saying to the jury, you know, even if that was true, couldn't he have said no? But that aside, the court didn't allow him to run with that defense. And the judge, by the way, was Michael McCarthy, who later became Attorney General of the United States. He ruled that we're in America and we follow American law. And if you allow everybody to become a law unto himself, then what you have is chaos. That was not a controversial proposition in 1995. I fear that it would be a much more controversial proposition today. So I think we're going backwards instead of forward. Let me leave you with this thought, and then I'll take questions as long as you like. I think we have it's always important in these kinds of discussions to point out that we couldn't have broken up the blind sheikh's terrorist cell in 1993 without the help of patriotic Muslims, who in fact actually volunteered to infiltrate, one guy did, to actually infiltrate his organization. We had Muslims who were working for us who helped pull the evidence together, who translated it, who helped us have a compelling narrative that we could take to a jury and get people convicted. We have Muslims who, in the United States, work every day to help us gather intelligence, without which we couldn't protect the country. I am not, and I would not, tar every single person because of their religious faith. I've personally known too many people who had America's best interest at heart to do anything that I would regard as that, frankly, obnoxious. But the fact that there are many of those Muslims, and the fact that there are millions of moderate Muslims, does not mean that Islam as a doctrine is moderate. There's got to be a difference in our minds between the Muslims that we see and the doctrine that we see before us in black and white. And it's absolutely true that there are varying interpretations of Islam, and there are places where Islam is practiced in a much more moderate way than in other places. But we shouldn't allow that to delude us into thinking that the interpretation of Islam that fuels the threat against us, which is not just a terrorist threat, but a broader threat against our society, we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that that's a fringe doctrine. That is mainstream Islam. If you were to ask Muslims worldwide, Would you be in favor of an interpretation of Islam that called for killing even Muslims who didn't share that interpretation? That is a fringe proposition in the Muslim world, and it may get, maybe 8 to 10%. Now, look, there's 1.4 billion Muslims in the world, right? To me, 10% is too high on something like that. But the alarming thing is, if you change the question, and mind you, the question I just asked is what the government uses to say that Islam is generally a peaceful religion because such a bare fringe of people follow this kind of rabid Al-Qaeda ideology. If you change the question and you say, should Israel be wiped from the face of the planet? Or is it appropriate to kill Americans who are operating in Islamic countries, even if they think they're doing humanitarian work? Or do you want to live in a Sharia society? Those aren't fringe propositions. Those aren't 10% propositions in the Muslim world. Depending on where you ask the question, those are 50, 60, 70, 80% propositions. Mainstream propositions. We just had this, as I mentioned before, the spontaneous, secular, progressive uprising in Egypt, right, that we were told about for weeks and weeks. They just held a referendum a couple of weeks ago on the Egyptian constitution. The fundamentalists won in a wipeout. They won 78% to 22%. And they basically have set up a system where it's virtually assured that the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be the main broker of power in that country whenever they reform their government. The one thing they could agree about, that was across the board agreed about, was that they couldn't touch Article 2 of the Egyptian Constitution, which is the article that establishes Islam as the state religion and installs Sharia as the fundamental source of law in the country. If you even hinted that that needed to go, you were taking your life into your hands. So, look, we have to protect our country. We have to do it in a way that honors our values, but we still have to protect our country. We don't want to label everybody as a terrorist or a terrorist sympathizer just because of what their religion is. But we can't close our eyes to the fact that the ideology that fuels the threat against us is not an aberration. It's not a fringe, lunatic ideology that's shared only by a handful of knuckleheads in Jersey City, and other than that, everything will be fine. This is a very common ideology throughout the Muslim world. It is held by among the most influential clerics in the Muslim world. And the longer I look at this, I don't like to say this, but a fact is a fact. When you hear a theology argument, it always sounds to me like it's the reformers and the moderates who are spinning and dancing on the head of a pin, whereas the blind sheikhs of the world are saying, you need to instill terror into the hearts of God's enemies, because right here in the Quran, it says, instill terror into the hearts of God's enemies. We found that when the blind sheikh gave a terrorist command, a terrorist incitement, and he found the language to couch that incitement in the Quran, while the government was saying that these terrorists were lying and perverting the doctrine and twisting it into something it wasn't, every single place where he cited the doctrine, every place where he cited scriptures, he cited it accurately. That's a fact. So I think we need to take that into account in protecting ourselves. Thank you very much for your attention.